Hello everyone and welcome. In this lecture we'll continue our discussion on reading text files. We'll look at read CSV method, we'll look at another method known as the read table method and see how we can read specific rows. So in the previous lecture we saw how we could use the read CSV method. So if you haven't imported pandas, please do so. I have already imported pandas from the previous lecture. So I will simply call the read CSV method and pass the name of the file we want to read. Let's pass example1.csv. So we saw this in the previous lecture, and simply run it and we see the contents of our CSV file. There's another method known as read table, and we can also read the contents of our CSV file by calling the read table method. So the only difference between read table and read CSV is we need to pass a second parameter known as the separator, sep, S-E-P, for separator, when we use the read table attribute. For instance, if we look at our example1.csv file, we see that each of the values are separated by a comma. So we need to pass a parameter comma. So let's see that. So we have pd.read_table. So we call the read table method and then pass the name of the file, example1.csv, and then we pass the separator as an attribute. So in this case, since the values are separated by a comma, we'll pass comma for our separator and run it. We see the same result, right? And if we don't want the first row to be a header, we can also pass the header attribute and set it to be equal to none. So now we have that. Okay, so don't forget to pass the separator attribute. Let's look at one more example of the read table method, pd.readTable. Let's look at our example2.csv file, and then we'll pass the separator comma and run it. So we have the contents of our file, and again we can pass the header attribute and set it to be equal to none, and we can also pass names for our column, and then we can pass whatever name we want. So last time I think we passed columns A, B, C, D, E, and then programming language for the last column. So you can pass whatever column that you want. Let's say AA, BB, CC, DD, and let's say programming underscore language. Run it. Now you have your columns and the contents of the file. So this is how we can use the read table method. Don't forget the separator. Okay, and the value for your separator could be any value. For instance, instead of here we used comma as a separator, right? If we use something else as a separator, we pass that separator. For instance, instead of a comma, if you use a colon, you use a colon as your separator. If you use, let's say, an underscore for your separator, you pass a separator. So that's the idea. Great. Let's move on. Let me save this. Okay, next let us look at this text file, example3.txt. Okay, let's use the read CSV method to read our text files. So pd.readCSV, and then we pass the name of our text file, which is example3.txt, and run it. So this is what our text file looks like. pd.readCSV, and then we have our text files, right? Now let's use the read table method to read our text file. So pd dot read underscore table, and then we pass our example3.txt file. So as I mentioned, we need to pass the separator attribute for our read table method, right? So in this example, we used a space as our separator, right? So in order to pass space as a separator, the first thing we need to call is the separator attribute, sep, S-E-P, and the value for space is as follows: / and then s plus. So this means single white space or more, one or more white spaces. Okay, so that's how you can pass a space separator. So you have your slash and then s, and plus stands for one or more white space. Okay, and run this. So now we have a nice format for our file, right? We have 3 columns, A, B, C, and then how many rows? 4 rows. Row AA, BB, CC, and DD. Now that we know the read table method, let's move on and see how we can skip rows. Okay, for this example, we'll look at this example4.csv file. Okay, so here I have commented some rows. This is a CSV file, and then we have another row. What if we have some lines we don't need to read? We can skip by using skiprows, and then so that's the content of the example4.csv file. So let's first load our CSV file by using the read CSV method. So pd.read underscore CSV, and then we'll pass the name of our file, example4.csv, example4.csv, and run it. So this is what our CSV file looks like. So you see here, it's not really nice. So we only want this row, which is the second row. We don't want the next 2 rows, but we want this row, the next row, and this row. So how can we filter out and read only the rows that we want? So for that, there is another attribute known as skiprows. By using that attribute, we can skip any number of rows that we don't want. Okay, so let's see an example. So let me copy and paste it here, pd.readcsv, example4.csv, and then we'll pass the skiprows attribute, and then pass the rows that we want to skip, and we pass those as a list. For instance, I don't want the first row and the third row. So if we don't want that, we just pass the index of those rows. So the first row is index 0. The third row is index 2. So now if we run this, you see now the first row and the third row are no longer here. So it starts with this row, and then we skipped this. So next we can use skiprows. Okay, so I just wanted to show an example. What we'll do next is skip all the unnecessary rows. So which are rows? The first one is row 0, index 0. That's the first row, and then this is index 2, and then index 3, 4, 5, 6, and then finally index 8. Those are the rows that we want to skip. So we'll pass the index of the rows that we don't want. So 0, 2, 3, 6, and 8. Now if we run it, we have a nice data frame, right? Nice and neat. So this is basically what we want to read. Okay, so you might come across a data set that you want to skip the unnecessary rows, and that's where the skiprows method come into play, or attribute, the skiprows attribute come into play. Okay, let's look at another example. So pd.readCSV, I have another CSV file. I named it example6.csv. Let's see what it looks like. So we have a bunch of rows, right? So I grabbed this data from the internet. So we have so many files here. We have so many rows. Let me save this in a variable called data. And now we can call data.head method. So this is what it looks like. It has 5 columns, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then a column known as key value. Let's call the tail method data.tail, and you see it has 9,993 rows. And if we only want to read a certain number of rows, we can pass the number of rows attribute. So here we know that the head method displays the first 5 rows, whereas the tail method displays the last 5 rows. And if we want to display certain number of rows, we can pass the n rows attribute. Let's see an example. So pd.read_csv, and then pass name of our CSV file, which is example6.csv, and let's pass the second attribute known as number of rows, and let's say we want to read the first 7 rows, so we just pass 7 and run this. Okay, now we have the first 7 rows, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, right? And similarly, we can pass whatever number of rows that we want. So now if we say, let's say 13, we have 13 rows now. Great. Just to recap what we have done in this lecture, we looked at the read table method, and when we use the read table method, we need to pass another attribute known as the separator attribute. And we also saw how we could skip rows that we don't want to read by passing the skiprows attribute. And we also saw how we can use the number of rows attribute to read specific number of rows.